Hello everyone, and welcome to Action Figure Posing 101, or how to pose your action figures. In this video, I will be sharing with you 3 pro tip secrets that will allow you to get your action figures in these dynamic, straight out of the comic book action poses. Whether you're a veteran action figure poser or you're just starting out, I'm sure this video has something for you. So if you're ready, let's get right to it. Pro tip number 1, comic books. Now this may seem counterintuitive. You're probably thinking, I could just watch the movies, watch the anime, I could do the video games. Why do I need to go back to comic books? Comic books are so old school. But I'll tell you this, most of the action figures that we have are based off of comic book superheroes. I mean, you could say Transformers may not be based off of them. You know, some of them are based off of their incarnations in the movies, in the cartoons and all that. But if you get right down to it, all these superheroes, they all came from the comic books at one point or another. Marvel heroes, DC superheroes, and manga, anime. I mean, they were born out of the imaginations of writers and artists in the comic book industry. If you pick up a comic book, or if you don't want to buy a comic book, you can get the digital copies, you flip through the pages, you get a bunch of static images that are somehow kinetic and dynamic. It's a very contradicting statement to say, but that's what comic book images are. And nowadays there are a plethora of new and up and coming comic book artists that have these amazing artwork gracing various comic books from Marvel, DC, Vertigo, Dynamite, you name it. Almost all the comic book houses and print houses now have just amazing artwork. And it's this artwork that I believe is the stepping stone to posing your figures in phenomenal ways. Now, you can always watch movies and say like, oh, the movies, that's the actors, they can pose better. But a moving picture somehow doesn't quite make an impression or doesn't stay in memory. Whereas if you look at pictures and images on comic books, I mean, just look at these comic books. You see motion in a static image. And once you get to see a lot of these images, you have a collection, you have a memory, a collected memory of these images. Somehow they'll easily translate into how you pose the figures. If you're starting out, you can just read a bunch of comic books, just look at the pages, and then get an action figure and just go wild. I mean, this is the first step. Don't think about anything else. Just go wild with a figure. Put the figure in these all sorts of weird poses or just dynamic poses and all that. You can do whatever you want just to get your action posing skills jump started and just to get into a groove of what it is. And sooner or later, after a few times, you'll develop a pattern. You'll get to see that the action figure can move this way, they move a certain way as how they're depicted in the comic books, and you'll get around to it. Now, I personally prefer Marvel comics. Now, you don't have to follow Marvel comics, you can do DC or whatever you prefer, but I personally have a preference for Marvel comics. And currently I'm reading Avengers, the flagship comic book Avengers. I've tried the other Avenger comic books, but the original Avengers comic books is really the one for me. The same goes for the X-Men. I'm reading Uncanny X-Men and Immortal X-Men. Those are the current titles I'm reading. I've tried the others, X-Force, X-Factor and all that, but I just wanted to stick to the basics. Comic books are getting a little bit pricey and expensive nowadays, so just to get the basics of everything, one Avengers book and one X-Men book I think is good enough for me. So pro tip number 2, know the character. Okay, look at these guys. Look at their poses. Not too bad, right? One can argue that they're pretty good, but a little knowledge about the character can really dramatically improve your posing ability and how the character will look like on the shelf. Let's begin with Spider-Man. Now, he's in a running pose, or sort of like a lunging pose. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing stopping you from doing that. But if you knew who the character was, Spider-Man is more of a lunging character. He keeps low, he's jumping from wall to wall, he's very agile, he's very quick, he jumps all over the place just to subdue his opponent. So you need to get him in a pose instead of just a running pose. You can get him into a running pose, that's fine, but he doesn't do a lot of running. He does a lot of squatting and keeping low, or just hanging out in the wall. He does a lot of leaping, so you can have him leap like that. And in the comic books, if you read up, his legs are always splayed because he's shooting the webs, and like that's how he's always depicted. Like, so you try to adapt to what the character is, and you try to get him in some poses. Like, he's always like looking around for danger. Spider sense are tingling. So that's how you try to get him in that pose. You try to get him in a situation where he's in his element. He's just about to subdue some bad guys. Okay? Next up, Lady J. Obviously, you can have her pose this way. She's about to take down some cobras, like, but if you try to do a little bit of research on Lady J, she's involved in covert operations. So the way she moves, she's more of like a secret agent. So you have to get her in poses that really show the kind of work she does for the Joes. She's always in a very furtive type of pose. Like, she's looking around for any bad guys, trying to blow her cover. And then she's armed with javelins. So you can pose her in ways that she's using her javelin, like she's throwing a javelin, like using her momentum to throw. Or you can have her, if you want her a standing pose, she's just ready to knock out some cobras. Try to pose her this way. Also, male and female characters pose differently. I mean, if she were the She-Hulk, you could probably pose her like that. But most of the time, the female characters, I like to pose them in a very flowing stance, because in the comic books, the female characters are a lot more graceful than the male characters. I mean, sure, male characters can also be very graceful, but I think the female characters are a lot more graceful in that regard, in terms of movement, acrobatic action. So you can pose her this way. You can get her in some poses that seemingly allow her to glide through the air. So like that. Okay, that's Lady J. Put Spider-Man there. And then finally, Darth Maul. Now, Darth Maul, very iconic character. As a Sith Lord, he's very imposing. You can pose him this way, standard pose in Duel of the Fates. But if you do some research, he's actually more of an acrobat. His fighting style is a lot of tumbling and turning. So if you want to get him in a dynamic pose, you have to think like an acrobat. What would an acrobat do? So instead of, you can put the lightsabers up in front. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. That's his standard pose. But when he's moving, his lightsaber is actually at the back. I noticed. So when he's running, he's blocking. So he puts the lightsaber at the back. You can have him with the lightsaber at the back, and it'll still look good. Like he's jumping into position, trying to get at Obi-Wan, or he's blocking. You can use the lightsaber to block. If you want him holding the lightsaber with two hands, there is a way to get him in a dynamic pose instead of the standard just holding him like this. Try to see, what the character would do with the bow or with a double-bladed lightsaber. So I like to get the lightsaber in various poses. If I want him holding it with two hands, try to do something unconventional like this, like he's about to stab. Yeah, cha, cha. So the whole idea is, if you get a little bit of knowledge on the kind of character you're dealing with, you can actually put them in a situation where they're in their element. So a little bit of knowledge can go a long way in getting these figures in such amazing dynamic poses. Pro tip number 3. Finally, we go to, I think this is my favorite tip out of all the 3. It's called form, function, and exaggeration. Let's talk about form and function first. Exaggeration deserves a separate discussion on its own. So form and function. Once you have an understanding of who the character is and you've got some inspiration from the comic books, it's also necessary to pose the figures in a way that are actually believable. For instance, the Mandalorian. This is a good pose, like, to have him in. But knowing that he's a gunslinger, he's full of armor. The normal stance, something that's believable, and that what he would normally do is to have his feet planted and he'd be shooting. Like, so proper form would be him with a planted stance, and he's shooting. He's like shooting the bad guys. Or maybe he's on his jetpack and he's flying. And sure, you could have him fly this way, but good form would have him in a more relaxed position like this. So basic idea is, how would the body move with certain poses or in certain situations? Like, for instance, nobody shoots a gun like, if he's shooting a gun, nobody shoots like that. I mean, sure, if you wanted to, but there is a recoil for the gun and he needs to aim. So the proper form, if you want to, I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but you need to have him planted and he needs to be aiming. So just understanding how the human body, how dexterous the character is, can give you ideas on how to pose him properly, instead of just going all out with the character just doing all these weird poses. Okay, one more example, Ahsoka. A lot of people, I find it very confusing how to pose Ahsoka. Sometimes they do it with the swords crossed this way. It's not a bad pose, actually pretty good. Some actually like to pose with the reverse blades, reverse hold on the blades. I do like posing Ahsoka like this as well. So Ahsoka is she's a very, well, she's not a huge person. Okay, she's not like Darth Vader, who needs to plant her feet. So she's a little bit more acrobatic. But then if you want to get her in an acrobatic pose, you still have to understand how the body will perform under this movement. So the kind of movement that the limbs go through when she's lunging, like when she's lunging. So the hands could go at the back. She could move it to the side when she's about to strike. I do like that too. So also, you have to understand how she uses the lightsabers to strike. For instance, this one, her main weapon, she used to strike. This one could be used to block. So you get her in a form that allows her to do both. So strike, and then this one blocks. And that way, you can get a really dynamic pose. And it's actually believable. Planted stance, very low, typical Ahsoka. Blocking, striking, stabbing. So there. All sorts of poses you can imagine, but without going over the top and having it very believable. And now let's talk about exaggeration. Now, exaggeration is a technique that a lot of comic book illustrators use, and that's probably the best tip they can give for young and up-and-coming illustrators. So it's nice to exaggerate, but don't go over the top, as I'll show later. So, for instance, Tony Stark, Iron Man. This is a good pose. This is actually how he is. You have a proper understanding what he does. Repulsor race. This is how he looks like in the comic books. But it would help if you do exaggerate a little bit. Like, just give him out in a flayed or flared stance like this. For instance, he's shooting a huge repulsor blast at Ultron. Like, so exaggerating that pose can get him in a better stance. Look at this. Versus the previous stance that he was just standing up with one leg forward and just lunging. Now he's like, so look at that. You can use flight stands, you can use bases, you can even just have the character pose on his own if the articulation and the joints will allow you to do so. For instance, Tony Stark, I think, yep, if you balance him properly, he can stand in this pose. Like, so you see the difference between the previous pose and this current pose. A little bit of exaggeration goes a long way. Now, let's talk about too much exaggeration. I've seen other reviewers review Storm Shadow posed this way. It's not bad. I mean, it's okay. I mean, sure, he could do that, but having the knowledge of form and function and who the character is, sure, he's a ninja, he has to do these acrobatic moves, but form and function, look at this pose. There's not enough leverage for him to actually slice anything because he's moving back, the legs are up in front. So if you want him jumping out and slicing somebody, you got to know where the legs go. So to have enough leverage, he needs to sort of put the arms back, and this one just slices in front, and the leg needs to lunge right in front like this. So I would probably pose him this way, like in a running, lunging pose. That. Or if you want his legs in a sort of kicking position, I know what the reviewer was trying to do. He wanted him in like a jumping pose, like he's about to kick. Usually when you're kicking someone, you need to balance yourself with your arms. You put them at the back. If you watch Taekwondo or karate, when they perform, they kick, and then the arms actually swing back. So I think the proper pose would be something like this. And you see how good the form is with the arms just about slicing. He just sliced somebody like, and then his legs are about to kick. So this one's a little bit more believable. I think it's a better pose. Now, if you want him kicking forward like this, you can still have the arms up in the back. But if you wanted him to slice something, the body there has to be some counter weight on the body for him to move his arms. So you can have him kick and then have the arms this way, but have the leg right in the middle where his momentum is going. So that could work, I think. I mean, there's really nothing wrong with any of the poses that I showed, but I'm just saying that there are ways to improve poses if you have a better understanding of certain elements of the character, of the figure, and how to get them into action poses. One final word before we leave this tutorial. I do hope that a lot of you have learned from this video on how to pose action figures, keeping in mind those 3 pro tips that I've shared. Comic books, know the character, form, function, and exaggeration. More importantly, I do hope this video has inspired a lot of you who are collecting these action figures to really take all of these tips and just go crazy and bust out your figures, bust them out into poses. There's really no right or wrong way to do things, but there's definitely better ways of doing things, particularly when posing action figures. I've been posing these figures since my days as FX Friends, my old channel, and now as Chefatron, and it's taken me more than a decade of posing, and a lot of people have been asking me, how do I do it? There's really no clear-cut way or thought process that I employ. Sometimes I just look at the character and a pose just emerges once I hold onto the character. And those are the 3 tips that can somewhat best summarize my posing process. So anybody can do this thing. You can just go and bust your figures into these amazing poses, but the most important thing is you have fun. You enjoy doing this, and the poses are just gonna come out naturally, and you're just going to be amazed at what you can accomplish just by getting the right inspiration to put your figures in these amazing poses. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining me in this informal tutorial. I do hope you've all learned something, a thing or two, and have gotten some inspiration to get your figures into these amazing poses. Do hit me up in the comment section below. Let me know what you think of this video. Do you think I should do more? I am actually planning on doing one more type of video that's akin to this, and it's how to pose Transformers. I think Transformers are in a league of their own in terms of posing. Do let me know in the comment section if you would like me to do a tutorial on how to pose Transformers. And as always, hit that notification bell so you never miss out on any of my latest video reviews. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.